Jim Jordan had exactly 30 seconds to stop Jasmine Crockett from playing the recording that would end his career. Instead, he made the one mistake that guaranteed she would press play and shock the entire nation. What happened next wasn't just the destruction of one of Congress's most feared interrogators. It was a masterclass in how preparation, patience, and perfect timing can bring down even the most powerful political bullies. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Committee Room 2141 in the Rayburn House Office Building had witnessed countless political battles, but none quite like what was about to unfold on this crisp October morning. The House Judiciary Committee was meeting to discuss government oversight and accountability, topics that Congressman Jim Jordan had built his entire reputation around. For 15 years, he had been the committee's most feared member, the man who could reduce witnesses to stammering confusion with his rapid-fire questioning and aggressive interruptions. At 59 years old, Jordan had perfected the art of political intimidation. His technique was legendary among Washington insiders. Lean forward aggressively, speak fast enough to prevent interruptions, ask 17 questions without waiting for answers, then act outraged when witnesses couldn't keep up. He had destroyed careers, ended investigations, and sent countless public officials running for cover with nothing more than his voice and his willingness to be the loudest person in any room. Today, he sat at the committee table with his usual confidence, his white shirt sleeves rolled up in his trademark style, no jacket in sight despite the formal setting. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set in the familiar expression of barely contained aggression that had made him a hero to his supporters and a nightmare to his opponents. He had his notes spread out before him, 3 different colored pens at the ready, and the absolute certainty that came from never having lost a public confrontation. But today was different, though Jim Jordan didn't know it yet. Sitting calmly at the opposite end of the committee table was Representative Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman from Texas who had been making waves since her arrival in Washington. At 44, she brought a prosecutor's precision to everything she did, along with something that Jim Jordan had rarely encountered in his long career, someone who was completely unintimidated by his reputation. Jasmine wore a sharp burgundy blazer over a black blouse, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that framed her face. Her makeup was flawless but understated, her jewelry minimal but purposeful. Everything about her appearance projected competence and control. But it was what she carried in her black leather portfolio that would change everything. The portfolio rested on the table in front of her, unremarkable from the outside, but containing something that would soon make Jim Jordan wish he had never entered politics. Inside were 3 things: a small digital audio recorder, a transcript of a conversation that Jordan thought no one would ever hear, and a set of documents that would provide the context to destroy him completely. The morning had started routinely enough. Chairman Jerry Nadler had called the hearing to order, announced the day's topic, and begun the usual round of opening statements. Republican members spoke about government overreach and the need for accountability. Democratic members countered with concerns about transparency and abuse of power. It was the standard political theater that filled C-SPAN broadcasts and put most viewers to sleep. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing for the cameras or playing to the partisan divide. She was waiting for her moment, and when it came, she would be ready. The first sign that this hearing would be different came when Chairman Nadler announced the witness list. They would be questioning Sarah Martinez, the former director of a government watchdog agency who had been forced to resign after refusing to drop an investigation into congressional ethics violations. It was exactly the kind of witness that Jim Jordan had built his career on discrediting. Martinez sat at the witness table, a slight woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had been through a political meat grinder. She had agreed to testify despite knowing that it would likely end any hope she had of working in government again. She clutched a folder of documents that represented 3 years of her life's work that had been terminated the moment it became inconvenient for certain members of Congress. Jim Jordan leaned back in his chair, already preparing his attack. He had done this hundreds of times before. He would question Martinez's credentials, attack her methodology, suggest political bias, and generally make her so uncomfortable that her testimony would be dismissed as partisan nonsense. It was a formula that had never failed him. But as he reviewed his notes, something nagged at him. 2 weeks earlier, he had received a call from someone claiming to have information about this hearing, information that could be damaging if it came to light. The caller had been vague about the details, but specific about the threat. Be careful what you say about Sarah Martinez. Some people know more than you think they do. Jordan had dismissed the call as typical Washington intrigue, probably some Democratic staffer trying to psych him out. He had gotten similar warnings before, and they had never amounted to anything. His aggressive tactics worked because they were based on careful preparation and strategic intimidation, not on anything that could be used against him. What he didn't know was that the call had come from someone who had been in a private meeting with him 6 months earlier, someone who had listened to him outline a strategy for undermining government oversight agencies, someone who had been smart enough to record every word. As the hearing began, Jordan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with political combat. This was what he lived for, the chance to be the smartest, most prepared, most aggressive person in the room. He had his questions ready, his timeline planned, and his exit strategy prepared for when he had completely destroyed the witness's credibility. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly through the opening statements, her hands folded on top of her portfolio. She didn't take notes during the Republican talking points about government overreach. She didn't respond to the Democratic complaints about partisan investigations. She simply waited, watching Jim Jordan prepare for what he thought would be another routine demolition of a government whistleblower. But Jasmine had spent the last 6 months preparing for this moment. As a former prosecutor, she understood that the most devastating attacks came not from aggression, but from patience, not from volume, but from precision. And she had something that Jim Jordan had never faced before: evidence. When Chairman Nadler recognized Jim Jordan for his 5 minutes of questioning, the atmosphere in the room immediately changed. Jordan leaned forward, his body language shifting from casual confidence to predatory focus. Sarah Martinez visibly tensed in her seat, knowing that she was about to face the full force of Jordan's legendary interrogation style. "Ms. Martinez," Jordan began, his voice already carrying an edge of skepticism, "you were fired from your position as director of the Government Accountability Office's Ethics Division, weren't you?" "I resigned, Congressman," Martinez replied carefully. "Right, you resigned," Jordan said with a smirk that suggested he knew better. "You resigned after your investigation was terminated for exceeding your authority and pursuing politically motivated—" "That's not accurate, Congressman." Jordan's voice immediately jumped in volume and speed. "Ms. Martinez, let me finish my question before you start making excuses. Your investigation was shut down because you refused to follow proper procedures, because you were pursuing a vendetta against Republican members of Congress, and because you couldn't provide any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Isn't that correct?" "No, Congressman, that's not. And isn't it true that your so-called investigation was based entirely on anonymous sources and unverified claims that you couldn't substantiate through any official documentation?" "Congressman, if you would let me answer—" "I'm not interested in your spin, Ms. Martinez. I'm interested in facts. And the fact is that you spent 3 years and millions of taxpayer dollars on a witch hunt that produced absolutely nothing. Isn't that right?" This was vintage Jim Jordan. Rapid-fire questions, constant interruptions, and an aggressive tone designed to rattle the witness and prevent them from giving coherent answers. He had used this technique to devastating effect against FBI directors, IRS commissioners, and dozens of other government officials. The strategy was simple: create chaos, prevent clear answers, and make the witness look evasive and unreliable. Sarah Martinez was clearly struggling under the assault. Her voice was getting smaller, her answers more fragmented. She kept trying to explain the complexities of her investigation, but Jordan wouldn't let her finish a sentence. The Republican members of the committee nodded approvingly at Jordan's aggressive questioning, while the Democrats looked frustrated but unsurprised. But Jasmine Crockett was watching with the cold calculation of a prosecutor who had seen this performance before. She had dealt with defense attorneys who used similar tactics, overwhelming witnesses with aggression to hide the weakness of their position. And she had learned that the best response to such tactics wasn't to match the aggression, but to wait for the perfect moment to expose the strategy for what it really was. That moment was about to come. Jim Jordan was hitting his stride now, completely confident that he had Sarah Martinez exactly where he wanted her. His questions came faster and more aggressively, each one designed to make her look incompetent and politically motivated. Ms. Martinez, you claim that your investigation was legitimate, but you never interviewed a single member of Congress directly, did you? You never gave anyone you were investigating a chance to respond to your accusations, did you? You operated in complete secrecy, making allegations without allowing for any due process whatsoever. Congressman, that's standard procedure for standard procedure. Standard procedure is to follow the law, Ms. Martinez, not to conduct secret investigations based on gossip and speculation. Jordan was so focused on his attack that he didn't notice the subtle change in Jasmine Crockett's posture. She had straightened slightly in her chair and was now watching him with laser focus. Her right hand had moved to rest on her portfolio, and there was something in her expression that would have warned him if he had been paying attention. But Jim Jordan was too caught up in his own performance to notice anything else. He was approaching the climax of his questioning, the moment when he would deliver the knockout blow that would completely discredit the witness and end any further discussion of government ethics investigations. Ms. Martinez, he said, leaning forward so aggressively that he was almost standing. Isn't it true that your entire investigation was nothing more than a partisan fishing expedition designed to harass Republican members of Congress? And isn't it true that when your superiors realized how politically motivated and procedurally flawed your investigation was, they had no choice but to shut it down and remove you from your position? It was at this moment that Jordan made his fatal mistake. Flush with confidence and certain that he had Martinez cornered, he decided to go for the kill shot. And Ms. Martinez, isn't it also true that you have absolutely no evidence, no recordings, no documents, no witness testimony that would support any of your allegations against any member of Congress? The question hung in the air for a moment, and in that brief pause, something shifted in the room. Sarah Martinez looked up with an expression that Jim Jordan had never seen from one of his victims before. It wasn't defeat or confusion. It was something that looked almost like relief. Actually, Congressman Jordan, she said quietly, that's not entirely accurate. Jordan's confident smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't how his witnesses usually responded. They were supposed to stammer and backtrack, not correct him with quiet confidence. What do you mean, not accurate? He demanded. I mean that your assumption about recordings is incorrect. And that's when Jasmine Crockett finally moved. Jasmine Crockett reached into her portfolio and pulled out a small digital audio recorder, placing it deliberately on the table in front of her microphone. The device was sleek, professional, and unmistakably real. The soft thud it made as it contacted the wooden table seemed to echo through the suddenly silent committee room. Jim Jordan's head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time in anyone's memory, he was speechless. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, his eyes fixed on the recording device with an expression that could only be described as dawning horror. Congressman Jordan, Jasmine said, her voice calm and clear, before you continue with your questioning, I think the committee should hear something that directly relates to Ms. Martinez's investigation and your claims about the lack of evidence. Jordan found his voice, but it came out higher and tighter than usual. Congresswoman Crockett, what exactly do you think you're doing? I'm preparing to play a recording of a conversation that took place 6 months ago in your office, Congressman. A conversation in which you outlined a strategy for undermining government oversight agencies and specifically discussed ways to discredit Sarah Martinez before her investigation could be completed. The silence in the room was deafening. Every camera in the chamber zoomed in on Jim Jordan's face, capturing the exact moment when one of Congress's most feared interrogators realized that he had become the target of an investigation himself. You can't, that's not, Jordan stammered, his usual rapid-fire delivery completely abandoned. "The recording is completely legal, Congressman. Ohio is a one-party consent state, and I was present for the entire conversation as a witness to your statements." This was news to everyone in the room, including Jordan. The meeting 6 months earlier had been arranged to discuss legislative strategy, and Jasmine had been invited as a freshman member who might be willing to support certain positions. Jordan had assumed she was a potential ally, someone who could be brought into his network of supporters. He had spoken freely, confidently, never imagining that anyone would record his words or use them against him. Chairman Nadler was looking back and forth between Jordan and Crockett, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that had never occurred in his experience. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is highly irregular." "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine interrupted politely but firmly, "Congressman Jordan has spent the last 15 minutes attacking Ms. Martinez's credibility and claiming that her investigation was baseless. I believe this recording provides essential context for the committee's understanding of how and why that investigation was terminated." Jim Jordan was frantically trying to calculate his options. He could object to the recording on procedural grounds, but that would only make him look guilty. He could try to discredit Jasmine, but she was a sitting member of Congress with an impeccable legal background. He could attempt to leave the hearing, but that would be political suicide and wouldn't stop the recording from being played. The digital timer on Jasmine's phone showed exactly 30 seconds from the moment she had placed the recorder on the table. 30 seconds for Jim Jordan to figure out how to prevent the destruction of his career. 30 seconds to find a way out of a trap that had been 6 months in the making. But instead of using those 30 seconds wisely, Jim Jordan made the one mistake that guaranteed Jasmine would press play. With his political career hanging in the balance and 30 seconds ticking away, Jim Jordan did what he had always done when faced with opposition. He attacked. "This is outrageous," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a setup. This is exactly the kind of underhanded, politically motivated garbage that we've come to expect from the radical left wing of the Democratic Party." It was the worst possible response. Instead of trying to minimize the damage or asking what was on the recording, Jordan had chosen to attack Jasmine personally and dismiss the evidence before anyone had even heard it. He had just guaranteed that every person in that room, and every viewer watching at home, would be absolutely certain that whatever was on that recording was devastating. Jasmine looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Congressman Jordan, you have approximately 20 seconds left to consider whether you want to continue with this approach." "I don't need 20 seconds. I don't need 20 minutes. This is a violation of trust, a breach of confidence, and probably illegal." "It's not illegal, Congressman, and the recording is about to play regardless of your objections. The question is whether you want to continue characterizing this as a partisan attack, or whether you want to acknowledge that your own words are about to speak for themselves." Jordan's face was red now, veins visible in his neck and forehead. "You recorded a private conversation. You came into my office under false pretenses. 10 seconds, Congressman." And that's when Jim Jordan sealed his own fate. Instead of using his final moments to prepare for damage control, instead of trying to provide context or explanation, he made one last desperate attack. "The people of Ohio didn't send me to Congress to be ambushed by freshman politicians with recording devices. They sent me to fight against exactly this kind of corrupt, underhanded—" "Time's up." Jasmine Crockett pressed play. The audio quality was crystal clear. Jim Jordan's voice filled the committee room, confident and casual, completely unaware that his words would one day be broadcast to the nation. The conversation had taken place in his office, and you could hear the relaxed atmosphere, the clink of coffee cups, the rustle of papers, the comfortable tone of politicians who thought they were among friends. Jordan's voice. "The Martinez investigation is becoming a real problem. She's got access to documents that could make things very uncomfortable for a lot of people." Unknown voice. "Can't you just have it shut down?" Jordan's voice. "We're working on it, but she's being stubborn. The woman actually thinks she's some kind of crusader for government accountability." There was laughter on the recording, Jordan's laugh unmistakably cruel and dismissive. Jordan's voice. What we need to do is destroy her credibility before she can release anything. Make her look like a partisan hack who's exceeding her authority. Get her fired for cause so that anything she's found gets buried with her career. The committee room was absolutely silent except for Jordan's voice coming through the speakers. Every Republican member was staring at their hands. Every Democratic member was staring at Jordan. The press gallery was frantically taking notes, and the cameras were focused on Jordan's face, which had gone from red to pale in the space of 30 seconds. Jordan's voice. The beauty of it is that we don't even have to engage with her findings. We just have to make sure nobody takes her seriously. Attack her methodology, question her motives, suggest she's politically biased. By the time we're done with her, nobody will care what she thinks she discovered. Jasmine's voice. Clearly audible on the recording. What if her findings are legitimate? What if there actually are ethics violations that need to be addressed? Jordan's voice. Jasmine, you're new here, so let me explain how this works. Ethics violations are only violations if they're politically inconvenient. If we can control the narrative, we can control the consequences. Martinez's investigation disappears, her findings get discredited, and everybody moves on. That's how Washington really works. The recording continued for another 2 minutes, with Jordan outlining in explicit detail his plan to undermine a legitimate government investigation, destroy a career civil servant's reputation, and cover up potential ethics violations by members of Congress. Every word was clear, every intention was obvious, and every listener understood that they were hearing a confession of political corruption at the highest levels. When the recording ended, the silence in Committee Room 2141 was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of sound that comes when an entire room full of people realizes they have just witnessed a career-ending moment. Jim Jordan sat completely still, his face ashen, his hands frozen on the table in front of him. For the first time in his congressional career, he had absolutely nothing to say. The man who had built his reputation on never being at a loss for words, who could talk his way out of any controversy and attack his way through any opposition, was completely speechless. Chairman Nadler was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Congressman Jordan, do you have any response to what we just heard? Jordan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around the room as if hoping someone would tell him this was all a nightmare, that he would wake up and find himself back in his usual position of power and control. But every face he saw reflected the same thing: shock, disgust, and the recognition that his political career was over. That conversation was taken out of context, he finally managed, his voice hoarse and uncertain. Jasmine Crockett responded immediately, her tone professional but devastating. What context would make it appropriate for a sitting member of Congress to conspire to destroy a government investigation and ruin the career of a public servant who was doing her job? Jordan tried to rally, to find some version of his old, aggressive self. You recorded me without my knowledge. You came to my office under false pretenses. This is entrapment. Congressman, you invited me to that meeting to discuss legislative strategy. I came as a member of Congress, and I listened as you outlined a plan to obstruct a legitimate investigation. There was no entrapment. There was only you revealing your true intentions when you thought no one would ever hold you accountable. Zara Martinez, who had been sitting quietly during Jordan's initial attack, now spoke with a voice that was steady and strong. Congressman Jordan, everything on that recording confirms what I experienced during my investigation. My superiors began questioning my methods and my motives immediately after I began looking into congressional ethics violations. I was pressured to narrow my focus, limit my scope, and eventually abandon the investigation entirely. When I refused, I was forced to resign. Jordan was drowning now, grasping for any lifeline. Ms. Martinez, your investigation was flawed from the beginning. You exceeded your authority. You pursued politically motivated— Congressman, Jasmine interrupted quietly. We just heard you admit that you didn't care whether the investigation was legitimate or not. We heard you say that ethics violations are only violations if they're politically inconvenient. Your own words contradict everything you've been saying for the last 20 minutes. The Republican members of the committee were in full damage control mode now. Some were frantically texting their staff. Others were whispering urgent conversations with their colleagues. A few had simply put their heads in their hands, recognizing that their party's most effective attack dog had just destroyed himself on national television. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, Jim Jordan made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. He tried to return to his trademark aggressive style, but his voice was shaky, and his usual confidence was completely gone. "This is a hit job," he declared, though the words came out more like a plea than an accusation. "This is exactly what's wrong with Washington. People recording private conversations, twisting words, using underhanded tactics to destroy reputations." Jasmine looked at him with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "Congressman Jordan, no one twisted your words. No one took anything out of context. We all just heard you explain, in your own voice, how you plan to destroy a government investigation and ruin someone's career to protect yourself and your colleagues from accountability. Those were your words, your plan, your values. You don't understand the pressure we're under. You don't understand how this place really works. I understand exactly how this place works, Congressman. I understand that some people believe their position gives them the right to abuse their power, destroy careers, and obstruct investigations. What I don't understand is how you thought you could do all of that and never face any consequences." Jordan was completely exposed now, stripped of his reputation for competence and his aura of invincibility. The man who had spent 15 years terrorizing witnesses and destroying opponents had been reduced to making excuses and begging for understanding. It was a complete reversal of power that everyone in the room could feel. Chairman Nadler finally found his voice. "Congressman Jordan, in light of what we've just heard, I think it would be appropriate for you to recuse yourself from any further questioning of Ms. Martinez." "You can't do that. You can't silence a sitting member of Congress based on an illegally obtained recording." "The recording wasn't illegally obtained, Congressman," Nadler replied wearily. "And I'm not silencing you. I'm suggesting that your credibility as a questioner has been compromised." It was a devastating understatement, and everyone knew it. Jordan's credibility hadn't just been compromised, it had been completely destroyed. His reputation as a fierce defender of government accountability had been revealed as a sham. His aggressive questioning style had been exposed as a cover for his own ethical failures. His entire political persona had crumbled in the space of 20 minutes. Within minutes of the recording ending, the story had exploded across every social media platform and news outlet in the country. The clip of Jordan's voice outlining his plan to destroy the investigation was being shared, analyzed, and quoted everywhere. Jordan recording became the #1 trending topic on Twitter within an hour. News anchors struggled to find adequate language to describe what they had just witnessed. CNN ran a breaking news banner that simply read, "Congressman caught on tape planning to obstruct investigation." Fox News, despite their usual support for Republican members, found it impossible to defend Jordan's words. Even his most loyal supporters couldn't explain away a recording of him explicitly planning to abuse his power. The reaction from Jordan's colleagues was swift and brutal. Republican leadership issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about the allegations and calling for a full investigation. Translation: Jim Jordan was on his own. Democratic members were less diplomatic, with several calling for his immediate resignation and possible criminal charges. But it was the reaction from ordinary Americans that was most devastating. Social media filled with stories from people who had been targeted by Jordan's aggressive questioning in other hearings, people who had watched him destroy careers and reputations with his rapid-fire attacks and dismissive attitude. The recording had revealed that his entire approach was not about seeking truth or ensuring accountability, but about protecting himself and his allies from the consequences of their actions. Late-night comedians had a field day. Saturday Night Live opened with a sketch recreating the moment Jasmine placed the recorder on the table, with the actor playing Jordan literally fainting when the device appeared. But even the comedy couldn't diminish the seriousness of what had been revealed. This wasn't just a political scandal. It was evidence of systemic corruption at the highest levels of government. Within 48 hours of the recording being played, the Office of Congressional Ethics announced that it was opening a formal investigation into Jim Jordan's conduct. The House Ethics Committee, despite its reputation for inaction, was forced by public pressure to begin its own inquiry. And most damaging of all, the Department of Justice indicated that it was reviewing the recording to determine whether federal obstruction of justice charges were warranted. Jordan's office went into full crisis mode, but there was no strategy that could overcome the clarity of his own recorded words. His legal team advised him to say nothing publicly while they assessed his options, but the damage was already done. Corporate sponsors began canceling events. Donors started distancing themselves. Even his most loyal supporters were quietly suggesting that he consider retirement. Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez found herself in a completely different position. Instead of being a discredited former government employee, she was now seen as a whistleblower who had been targeted for doing her job. Her original investigation was immediately reopened under new leadership, and she was invited to testify before multiple committees about the obstruction she had faced. Most importantly, the recording had changed the entire dynamic around government oversight and accountability. Other career civil servants who had been intimidated into silence began coming forward with their own stories of political pressure and obstruction. The precedent that Jasmine had set, that powerful members of Congress could and would be held accountable for their abuse of power, inspired others to speak truth to power. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath of the hearing was both triumphant and difficult. She had achieved something that many thought impossible. She had held one of Congress's most powerful members accountable for his abuse of power. But the victory came with significant personal costs. Jordan's supporters launched vicious attacks against her, questioning her ethics, her motives, and her right to represent her district. Death threats forced her to increase her security. Right-wing media outlets ran segments suggesting that she had violated congressional norms and couldn't be trusted. The attacks were personal, ugly, and relentless. But Jasmine had expected this. As a black woman in Congress, she knew that holding powerful white men accountable would make her a target. She had prepared for the backlash, both legally and emotionally, and she had something that her attackers didn't: the support of millions of Americans who were tired of watching corruption go unpunished. The recording also revealed something important about Jasmine's character and strategy. She had spent 6 months sitting on damaging information about one of Congress's most powerful members, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. She had endured Jordan's attacks on other witnesses, knowing that she had the power to stop him, but choosing to wait until the moment when her revelation would have maximum impact. It was a level of strategic thinking and emotional control that impressed even her critics. She hadn't acted out of anger or revenge. She had acted with the calculated precision of a prosecutor building a case. And when the moment came, she had delivered the evidence with devastating effectiveness. The Jordan recording didn't just end one political career. It changed the entire culture of congressional oversight. Members of both parties began to understand that their private conversations might not remain private, that their abuse of power might be documented, and that there were people like Jasmine Crockett who were willing to hold them accountable regardless of the personal cost. Government employees who had been intimidated into silence began speaking up about political pressure and obstruction. Investigators who had been forced to limit their scope or abandon their work came forward with evidence of interference. The culture of impunity that had protected corrupt members of Congress for decades began to crack. Universities began using the Jordan recording as a case study in political accountability and ethical leadership. Business schools analyzed Jasmine's strategic thinking and timing. Law schools examined the legal and ethical implications of recording conversations with public officials. The moment had become a teaching tool for understanding how power can be challenged and accountability can be enforced. Most importantly, the recording had shown ordinary Americans that corruption could be exposed and punished, even at the highest levels of government. It restored faith in the possibility of justice and accountability, and it inspired others to demand better from their elected officials. 6 months after the recording was played, Jim Jordan announced that he would not seek re-election. His official statement cited a desire to spend more time with family. But everyone understood the real reason. His political career was over. The House Ethics Committee had found him in violation of multiple rules regarding the obstruction of investigations. The Department of Justice had declined to file criminal charges, but only because the statute of limitations had expired on some of his actions. More importantly, Jordan's entire network of allies and supporters had distanced themselves from him. The aggressive, intimidating style that had once made him powerful was now seen as evidence of corruption and abuse. Other members of Congress who had used similar tactics found themselves under increased scrutiny. The era of consequence-free bullying in congressional hearings was over. Sarah Martinez was not only vindicated, but was offered a new position as Inspector General of the Government Accountability Office, with expanded powers to investigate congressional ethics violations. Her original investigation was completed under new leadership and resulted in formal censures of 3 members of Congress and new rules governing the relationship between legislators and oversight agencies. For Jasmine Crockett, the recording had established her as one of Congress's most effective oversight members. She was appointed to multiple committees and became a sought-after voice on issues of government accountability and ethics. More importantly, she had shown that freshman members could hold senior members accountable, that careful preparation could overcome political bullying, and that truth, when properly deployed, was more powerful than aggression. Committee Room 2141 looks exactly the same as it did on that October morning when Jim Jordan's career ended. The same mahogany panels line the walls, the same marble floors reflect the overhead lights, and the same witness table sits ready for the next hearing. But something fundamental has changed in that room, and in every similar room across the Capitol. Members of Congress now understand that their words have consequences, that their actions are being watched, and that there are people like Jasmine Crockett who are prepared to hold them accountable. The culture of impunity that once protected corrupt officials has been replaced by a new reality: transparency, accountability, and the understanding that power comes with responsibility. The Jordan recording became more than just a political scandal. It became a symbol of what's possible when someone is willing to document abuse, wait for the right moment, and act with strategic precision. Jasmine hadn't just destroyed one corrupt politician, she had changed the entire game. Her approach had been methodical: identify the target, gather evidence, wait for the perfect opportunity, and then strike with devastating effectiveness. She had shown that you don't need to match aggression with aggression, that you don't need to shout to be heard, and that the most powerful weapon against corruption is often patience combined with preparation. The 30 seconds that Jim Jordan had to prevent his own destruction were really 30 seconds that revealed everything about the difference between real power and the illusion of power. Jordan had confused bullying with strength, aggression with effectiveness, and intimidation with intelligence. When faced with someone who understood the difference, his entire approach collapsed. Jasmine Crockett had shown America what accountability looks like when it's done right: calm, prepared, strategic, and absolutely devastating to those who abuse their power. She had proven that in the end, truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be spoken clearly at exactly the right moment. And sometimes 30 seconds is all it takes to change everything. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.